Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast, if you never miss an episode, I invite you to consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Please visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome art historians Emma Rutherford and Elizabeth Goldring back to the podcast to discuss their recent discovery of a cabinet miniature of Arbella Stuart. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm so excited today because I'm actually joined by two wonderful guests. So we have Elizabeth Goldring and Emma Rutherford, and I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourself. So maybe we'll start with you, Elizabeth. Hello.
Hello, Natalie. Thank you so much for inviting us onto your podcast. My name is Elizabeth Goldring. I'm an honorary reader at the University of Warwick. My research and teaching interests have always been firmly focused on the Tudors, with particular emphasis on Tudor painting and Tudor court culture. My most recent book, which was a biography of Queen Elizabeth I's favorite painter, was called Nicholas Hilliard, Life of an Artist, and it came out in 2019. And we, of course, chatted about it in a couple of podcasts that we recorded during lockdown, which seems a long time ago now. Since that book came out, I've been working on various projects, chiefly a new book on Hans Holbein the Younger, which with any luck might come out in 2026, which will be the 500th anniversary of Holbein's arrival in England. But in the last year or so, I unexpectedly got drawn back into Hilliard and his world with very exciting and unexpected discovery, which is the reason for our chatting with you today.
Oh, wonderful. And how exciting about the Holbein book. I can't wait for that. That's really wonderful news. And of course, we have the wonderful Emma Rutherford with us as well. Hello, Emma.
Hello, Natalie. Just to echo Elizabeth, thank you for inviting us on. We're really excited to talk about this project that we've been working on and kept it under wraps for a year. So it's been really exciting. But to introduce myself, as you say, I am Emma Rutherford and I specialize in portrait miniatures. So I look at works of art from a much wider time frame than Elizabeth, from the 1520s through to the 1820s. But I particularly love the Tudor period with portrait miniatures. I find it the most exciting era. And of course, it's the birth of the portrait miniature in Henry VIII's time. So you and I have also spoken about portrait miniatures from that period. So I've been looking at portrait miniatures for about 25 years now and specializing in them. And I run something called the Limner Company, limnings being the description of the earliest portrait miniatures before they were called portrait miniatures. So the Limner Company set up a year ago. And before that, I worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum, various auction houses, and most recently was a consultant for Philip Mould and Company in London.
Wonderful. Thank you. And before we talk about this incredibly exciting project that the two of you have been working on, I can't believe you kept it quiet for a year. That's amazing. That must have been really difficult. I thought maybe we could just have a little intro about Nicholas Hilliard in case anyone listening hasn't heard of him before. So Elizabeth, do you want to tell us a little bit about him?
Sure. Nicholas Hilliard was born in Exeter in the west of England in about 1547, which is to say at the tail end of Henry VIII's reign. He died in London in 1619, so well into the reign of James I. And he's hugely significant in the history of British art because he was the first native-born English artist to attain an international reputation for excellence during his own lifetime. He was mainly known then, and indeed is mainly known now, as a miniature painter or limner, which is to say someone who paints in water-based paints on vellum on a small scale. He served as Queen's limner to Elizabeth I and King's limner to James I, in which capacity he decisively shaped both Elizabeth's and James's images in the eyes of contemporaries and posterity. But it's important to remember he also worked in numerous other media. He painted in oils in grate. He devised designs for goldsmiths and jewelers. He devised designs for book printers. Really, I think Hilliard, who was often strapped for cash, was happy to turn his hand to pretty much anything that would generate income. From the moment he first portrayed Elizabeth, which we know took place in a garden at Hampton Court Palace in the summer of 1571, until her death a little over 30 years later in 1603, he was her favorite, most trusted portraitist. But his miniatures were much admired by other monarchs as well. Many continental kings and queens sought Hilliard's work, such as Catherine de' Medici, to cite just one example. Pretty much everybody who was anybody at the Elizabethan court sat to Hilliard or wanted to sit to Hilliard. And as a result, our perceptions of the appearances and by extension, the personalities of many of the most significant figures of this period in history. So I'm thinking of Raleigh, Drake, the Earls of Leicester and Essex, are largely derived from images that Hilliard crafted. So he's hugely important, both in the history of British art, but also in terms of the reception of the Tudor period, our understanding of the Tudor period, and how the Tudors have really come down to us over the centuries.
Thank you. And I think I absolutely need to hear about this project, this discovery now. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that and the journey that you both went on, and also about this portrait?
Yes. So I've been lucky enough to have a few discoveries over the last 25 years. And I think it fits with the portrait miniature that you do get these surprises because of their secretive nature when they're first painted, to then be hidden from sight and then rediscovered perhaps is partly in their nature. But yes, I was actually shown an image of this cabinet miniature that we're talking about in this episode on a mobile phone by a conservator, which in some ways is our modern day equivalent of a portrait miniature, being a sort of handheld image that you want to look at daily. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, because I was racking my brains to think, are there any other full-length portraits of women by Hilliard? I could recall a handful of full-length cabinet miniatures of men, but not female subjects. And the other thing that struck me, apart from so many things really, was all the symbolism in this portrait. So I'm sure your listeners are going to be able to access an image of this portrait, but they'll notice these circular shapes all over the upper part of the sitter's gown, which are armillary spheres. There are stars woven into her dress, her skirt. There's a tree by her side, and she's painted in a outdoor setting. So there were so many things to sort of get my teeth into that I boldly said to the person who showed me the image, well, if you can tell the owner, I'll find out who she was, which was quite a statement. But I just felt there was so much to go on. I was going to be able to find her. So I did some initial research and looked at where this painting had come from. The other thing that will strike your listeners when they see the image is it's how close this woman looks to Elizabeth I. I mean, at first glance, this could be the Queen, and that is in the grandness of the gown, even her face, slightly her hair colouring. And I thought, well, it can't be Elizabeth because she's far too young for the date of the costume. But who else would be bold enough to look quite so much like Elizabeth I in their painting by Hilliard. And that's when I started speaking to Elizabeth, and together we embarked on all sorts of research. But Elizabeth did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of going back to the original sources. So yeah, perhaps we might want to hear from her now.
Yes, I'd love to. And so this is a portrait that neither of you had seen before this, is that right?
Never.
That's
and it's totally
correct.
unpublished. Yeah.
Amazing.
It seems to have been under the radar for, well, really pretty much from the time it was created. As Emma mentioned, the costume very much pointed to a date in the early 1590s. And thinking about who the sitter could be, we knew it had to be someone extremely wealthy, of extremely high status, because of the lavishness of the gown. The sitter is shown in court dress, but this is an exceptionally elaborate quasi-regal brand of court dress. We started digging around in the archives and very quickly discovered that all roads seemed to be leading in various ways to Lady Arbella Stuart, the likely sitter. Lady Arbella, obviously, having been a granddaughter and ward of Bess of Hardwicke, and via her paternal grandmother, Lady Margaret Douglas, a direct descendant of Henry VII. So in the early 1590s, she was one of course, a handful of viable contenders for the throne. Elizabeth I, of course, was refusing to name a successor, and there was considerable anxiety about what would happen when she died. And Arbella was one of a small number of candidates who were widely recognized as having a viable claim. And what we discovered in the archives was a payment from Bess of Hardwicke to Nicholas Hilliard dating from late July 1592 for what had to be a portrait of Arbella, because diplomatic correspondence from the same period revealed that repeatedly from the late summer of 1591 through the early spring of 1592, various individuals on the continent were keen to acquire a portrait of Arbella, specifically by Hilliard, in connection with possible marriage negotiations with the son of the Duke of Parma. So this was all just incredibly exciting. And obviously the date of the payment slotted in perfectly with everything that the costume was telling us about the probable date of the portrait. And I mean, really, we had to kind of keep pinching ourselves, because we just couldn't believe our luck, in a sense, that every time we went into the archives, we kept finding more and more documentary evidence that very much pointed to Arbella being the sitter. We know that on the same day that Hilliard was paid by Bess of Hardwicke in late July 1592, Roland Lockie, who recently had completed an apprenticeship with Hilliard, was paid for what seems to have been a copy of this image. But Hilliard's is described in the accounts as a greater image, which in Elizabethan English meant larger, i.e. a cabinet miniature. Lockie's was described as a lesser image, so smaller. So if Lockie's image is out there, and we don't know if it is or not, it is probably a head and shoulders oval miniature showing the face seen in Hilliard's cabinet miniature, but without all of the details of the garden setting, etc.
It's so exciting. And do you mind just clarifying again just the difference between the cabinet miniature and the portrait miniature, if just in case our listeners haven't seen those two before?
So I should explain that cabinet miniature is a term that we as art historians use for convenience, but so far as we know, it was not in circulation as a term in the 16th century. So probably Hilliard never uttered the words cabinet miniature. But to distinguish a cabinet miniature from what, I guess, for lack of a better term, we might call a normal miniature or an ordinary miniature. The ordinary miniature, which was Hilliard's bread and butter throughout his 50-year career, typically showed the sitter just in head and shoulders against a plain background, often a solid blue background, often with a gold inscription around the periphery, giving the date on which the portrait was executed and possibly the sitter's age. These miniatures, ordinary miniatures that is, were small enough to be held in the palm of a hand, and they were often encased in bejeweled settings and worn as lockets or brooches. So that type of miniature Hilliard was producing constantly from the early 1570s, when he first burst onto the scene, having portrayed Elizabeth I, until his death in 1619. But for a brief 10-year window between about 1585 and 1595, Hilliard branched out into something else called cabinet miniatures, or which we call cabinet miniatures. These were slightly larger miniatures. They vary, but some are about A5 size, some are about A4 size. They show the figure in full length, sometimes in an internal architectural setting, sometimes, as in the case of this recently discovered miniature, outdoors. They, in effect, attempt to use all of the tropes and props typically associated with large, sometimes life-sized oil paintings in grate, try to incorporate all of that and fit it into a much smaller surface. The clever thing about the production of a cabinet miniature in connection with dynastic marriage negotiations is that such an image still would have been small enough to be easily portable, which is an important consideration if you're transporting an image across long distances, but big enough to include far more detail than the quote-unquote normal head and shoulders miniature. So this cabinet miniature, for example, not only shows the sitter's entire figure and form, but enables Hilliard to really go to town with conveying her wealth and her status through the richness of her dress. There are various flowers and plants, which I suspect are there to indicate or to hint at her future fecundity, always, of course, an important consideration in dynastic marriage negotiations. The documentary sources that we consulted, the ones, in other words, that showed that Bess of Hardwick had paid Hilliard for a greater miniature by Hilliard in late July 1592, also made clear that that payment came at the end of about an 8-month visit to the south of England by Arbella and Bess, during which they spent a great deal of time at Greenwich Palace. We know Bess was a big tipper, and so we know from these financial accounts of hers that she and Arbella were regular guests of the Queen at Greenwich Palace in May, June, and July 1592, because Bess was forever tipping the Queen's gardeners. So I think it's probably fair to suggest that this miniature, this cabinet miniature, which shows Arbella in an outdoor setting with an imposing brick building behind her, likely shows her in a garden at Greenwich Palace with the facade or a facade of the palace behind her. And of course, this would be very fitting for an image that in many ways is casting her in the mold of Queen Elizabeth and emphasizing that she is a potential successor to Queen Elizabeth, because Hilliard had first portrayed Elizabeth outdoors in a garden at Hampton Court in the early 1570s. So there are just so many fascinating resonances with this image.
Emma, I was going to say, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say that I mentioned earlier on these armillary spheres that are embroidered into her gown. And of course, that was a personal symbol of Elizabeth I. She includes them in many of her oil portraits as well. So there are just so many echoes here of the Queen and connections to the Queen that are still obvious centuries later to us today. The person who owned the miniature actually thought it was Elizabeth I, and we weren't very surprised to hear that.
Yeah, I think that's when I first saw it, I thought, oh my goodness, that totally looks like the Queen. And there are a number of portraits from around that time that are kind of confusing, look like the Queen, possibly could be the Queen. But Emma, did you sort of think straight away Lady Arbella Stuart, or was it more a process or a journey that you went on?
Well, Lady Arbella Stuart pops up over and over again in portrait miniatures of unknown women from this period. And she's about 16 in this portrait, but other portrait miniatures that are said to be her usually show her with flowing hair connected to a portrait, which is, well, there are a couple of versions, but there's one at Hardwick Hall where she's about 13, and this flowing hair is obviously a sort of allusion to her youth, wearing her hair down. Here it's much more formal, but her iconography is very, very confused. And Elizabeth and I found that really there are no definite portraits of Arbella Stuart in existence. They all have a slight query around them, or are very overpainted, or had inscriptions added. But the more we looked into this one, I mean, we had a long list of suspects, and one by one we were able to disprove them. But there aren't that many contemporary accounts of what Arbella looked like, even though she's at court a couple of times, and there's plenty of opportunity to describe her. They're very ambassadors, etc., very vague about her appearance, calling her things like sufficiently handsome, or there's nothing to really know what she looked like in terms of the documentary evidence.
That does make this discovery even more exciting, doesn't it? That's amazing. And so you were talking a little bit earlier, Elizabeth, about the context of the commission. And I know there's a really fascinating spy connection. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, Emma and I found various pieces of epistolary evidence that made clear that in late 1591 and early 1592, Arbella's portrait, and specifically a portrait of her by Hilliard, repeatedly had been sought in connection with a possible dynastic marriage to Ranuccio Farnese, the son of the Duke of Parma. But what we found as we started digging deeper into all of this was that these were not straightforward run-of-the-mill marriage negotiations. And in fact, the negotiations and Hilliard's miniature all seem to have been part of a strategy devised by William Cecil Lord Burleigh and his son Sir Robert to drive a wedge between Philip II, obviously at this date Protestant England's archenemy, and the Duke of Parma, who was Philip II's Governor General in the Spanish Netherlands. Now, whether the Cecils and indeed Queen Elizabeth would actually have sanctioned such a match had push come to shove, I think is debatable. But it seems very clear that in late 1591 and early 1592, they were very, very keen to give every appearance of being fully behind such a match. Now, at the heart of this plan was the shadowy figure of Michael Moody, who in late 1590 was released from the Tower of London for his alleged involvement in the Stafford plot to assassinate Elizabeth. In the spring of 1591, a few months after Moody had been released from the Tower, he offered his services to the Cecils, claiming that he could infiltrate Catholic communities on the continent better than anyone else. The Cecils don't seem to have been entirely sure where Moody's loyalties lay, but nonetheless, they decided to send him to the Low Countries with instructions to infiltrate the Duke of Parma's inner circle and to do whatever he could to talk up and encourage the idea of a match between Ranuccio and Arbella. But the Cecils didn't fully trust Moody, so they placed several informants on his tail. And it's from piecing together the reports of the informants, plus the reports that Moody himself filed to the Cecils, that we know that between the late summer of 1591 and about Easter time, 1592, Moody made multiple trips from the Low Countries to England for the express purpose of trying to extract an image of Arbella from Hilliard so that he could show it to Parma and his son. And Moody, in fact, complains a lot in his dispatches about how difficult this is proving. We don't know if that's because he couldn't track Hilliard down or if Hilliard just was not as receptive as Moody had hoped. It's unclear if it was always the plan that Moody would approach Hilliard, or if this was something that Moody improvised. We know from other missions that Moody undertook later in the 1590s that he seems to have had a theatrical side and would sort of get deep into character and would often go a bit off-piste and improvise all sorts of extra features to his various missions, which had not been authorized. So we don't know if this is one of those situations or if the Cecils from the get-go envisioned that Hilliard should be involved. They were, at this date, not just leading the spy services, but were also Hilliard's chief patrons. So either scenario is plausible. But what we do know is that certainly by the autumn of 1591, the Cecils were aware that Moody was approaching Hilliard on a regular basis and trying to extract an image of Arbella from him. There's a certain sense that Hilliard was stalling, possibly, hence Moody's need to make multiple trips to England. And certainly stalling would have been advantageous from the Cecils' point of view and the Queen's point of view, since, as I mentioned, they don't necessarily seem to have wanted an actual marriage to happen, but drawing out the process of the negotiations might well have served their purposes. And I think all of this casts new light on a payment Hilliard received in December 1591 from the Queen, thanks to the intervention of Lord Burleigh. And this was a payment for £400 tax-free, an absolutely astronomical sum for 1591. Now, this payment has long been known to Hilliard scholars and traditionally has been said to have been the Queen's way of making up for the fact that often in the past she had been slow to pay Hilliard, and I think probably in some cases didn't really pay him properly at all for some commissions. But it's such a huge sum. And given what we now know about this cabinet miniature of Arbella and the wider context, I think we have to assume, particularly given the wording of the gift, which is to thank Hilliard for his good and faithful service, I think going forward, we probably need to assume that this payment of £400 was to thank him for whatever it was that he was doing to perhaps stall Moody, or certainly to cooperate with this counter-espionage plan that the Cecils seem to have hatched.
That is such a fascinating backstory. I'm sort of feeling like there might be an inspiration for a novel somewhere in there in the future.
You're not the first person to have said that. In fact, several people have said this needs to be, a Netflix series or something similar.
Oh, I love it. It has all those wonderful elements that we love to see on screen as well. So that's exciting. So perhaps some of our listeners, that have seen the portrait have thought that it reminded them of another one. It certainly reminded me of the Ditchley portrait, Emma. So do you want to tell us about some of those similarities between those two portraits?
Yes. Well, I mean, the silhouette of Arbella in the cabinet miniature is an absolute sort of carbon copy, really, of the Ditchley portrait, and this cabinet miniature coming to light has really helped anchor when the Ditchley portrait might have been completed, because there's always been a little bit of confusion over that. But we assume this is again completely deliberate in connecting Arbella with Elizabeth. I think there's another interesting element to that. We found Arbella such a fascinating character. And I know on your podcast, you're a real champion of pulling out the stories of women from this period, which have often been lost. And I think there are well over 100 letters written by Arbella, which gave us a real sense of her personality. But just as in this cabinet miniature, that's quite well repressed. Here she's very emblematic of her status and position at court, just as perhaps certainly Elizabeth is doing in the Ditchley portrait. It's all about the power and status and less about the personality. There's such a strong connection with that portrait, and such a deliberate connection, clearly, that Hilliard must have seen the Ditchley portrait before he painted this cabinet miniature.
And I think it's pretty clear that this is an incredibly exciting and important discovery. But maybe, Elizabeth, just to start wrapping up our conversation, if you had to summarize why this is such an important discovery, what would you say?
Well, I think it's important for a number of reasons. As we mentioned earlier, so far as we know, the only extant cabinet miniature by Hilliard that depicts a female sitter. So that's exciting in and of itself, even if we didn't know her identity. The fact that we now do know that it's Arbella means that we now have a reliable image of Arbella. As Emma mentioned earlier, an awful lot of portraits, miniatures, but also oil paintings have over the centuries been said, often with little or no evidence, to be images of Arbella, with the result that her iconography has become very confused and very confusing. And I think this image now will give people going forward a touchstone for what Arbella looked like, at least circa 1592, and might perhaps help to clear up some confusion about various other images, which perhaps optimistically have been said to be depictions of Arbella. Assuming that it is Greenwich Palace that is shown in the background and the gardens in which Arbella is placed, then this image also constitutes a rare contemporary depiction of Greenwich Palace and its grounds in the late Elizabethan period. It sheds new light, of course, also on the Ditchley portrait. As Emma mentioned a moment ago, there has always been some confusion about exactly when the Ditchley portrait was commissioned. It has long been agreed that it must date from about 1592, because Sir Henry Lee invited Queen Elizabeth and the entire court to Ditchley Park in Oxfordshire as part of that summer's progress. And the Queen spent a couple of days at Ditchley in September 1592. But the question has always arisen, was the Ditchley portrait commissioned by Sir Henry Lee in advance of her visit, i.e. before September 1592, possibly so that it could be unveiled in the course of the visit, perhaps even incorporated into some of the festivities, or was it commissioned after September 1592 in a purely commemorative capacity? And because documentary evidence has enabled us to date this Hilliard cabinet miniature so precisely, so that we know that Hilliard completed it, or certainly was paid for completing it, in late July 1592, and given that he must have seen, if not a completed version of the Ditchley portrait, then certainly a reasonably well advanced version of the Ditchley portrait as of that date, I think there can be very little doubt that Sir Henry Lee commissioned the Ditchley portrait in advance of Elizabeth's visit. So that's quite exciting and has a lot of potential implications in terms of our understanding of the visual culture of the Elizabethan progresses. I think as well, this cabinet miniature captures Arbella at this extraordinary moment when she could have been queen potentially at some future point. Of course, it doesn't work out that way. And in many ways, everything that came after was, well, her life was in many ways very sad. And she has, to a large extent, been forgotten in the intervening centuries. But she had an extraordinary life. And I really hope that this cabinet miniature and its discovery will help put Arbella back on the radar a bit. And I guess last, but by no means least, I think the discovery of this cabinet miniature is a wonderful reminder that there are still extraordinary works of art out there, hidden under the bed or in an attic or tucked away in the back of a cupboard. We tend to think that all the interesting, important works of art are already well known, are already in museums, or, works that we've all seen reproduced many times in books. But this just goes to show, I think, that there are still extraordinary things out there waiting to be discovered, particularly, I think, where miniatures, cabinet or otherwise, are concerned, because they are smaller and more easily, sort of tucked away and forgotten about. So, if anyone has something interesting out there hidden in a cupboard, let us know.
Exactly. Absolutely. It's exciting on so many levels, and what amazing research and detective work that the two of you did. So exciting. Now, I'm sure that all our listeners now would like to learn more about you and follow your work, because you do such amazing things. So Emma, if people wanted to kind of keep up to date with what you are doing, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, I have an Instagram account where I look at all things miniature. So that's quite a good place. And that's _portrait_miniature, or my website, www.portraitminiature.com is another good place to look, because we have regular blogs on there by guest bloggers, as well as miniatures you can buy or read about. So yes, those are the best places to find me.
Oh, I'd love to own a miniature. I've got to save my pennies up, and then I'll be in touch with you. Elizabeth, where should people go to find more about your work?
Well, Instagram, elizabeth.goldring would be a good place to start. I also have a webpage as part of the University of Warwick's website, but it's a frightfully long address.
Oh,
so thanks.
I can add the links to all of those, so it makes it nice and easy for our listeners to find you. But thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time to come onto the podcast and talk to us about this incredible discovery. It's been such a pleasure hearing about your wonderful journey.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you so much. It's been a real treat to talk about her again.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.